Hey, there you are.
That's better.
Yeah.
I
No,
can hear. Well, obviously, I don't know what's different because it was exactly the same settings, so I don't play with because of just this problem.
oh, well, maybe it was waiting for me to get in before it was going to work.
Well, I could see you a few
Oh,
minutes ago, but
hmm.
I didn't come up and you weren't hearing me because of whatever reason.
Right.
So I left and came back.
Yep. Well, that worked.
Yeah, it
Sometimes,
often does.
yeah, it does. Yeah. There's nothing like turning things off and turning them on again to solve most problems.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Oh, I see Mark's arrived too.
Hey, Mark. How are you?
Yeah, morning.
Hi. I noticed you posted. I haven't had a chance to catch up with all the stuff that's coming across my Substack, but I noticed you posted on note taking. Are you gonna start doing more in that space, or you just dropping a?
Well, I've done a lot of blog posts on note taking,
Mhm.
and it's been a professional interest of mine
Right.
way back.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I was just wondering if you were going to
And
start, sort of kind of
not in Substack. I
representing or recycling those. Yeah.
maybe to some extent I've done a little of that already.
Hmm.
Partly because I can't come up with anything new to write about, but but I'm working on it. And I that's the thing I keep looking for. I keep hoping there'll be a new book on
Yeah.
note taking and systems of note taking, and I hope to find something um, on. I mean, I've always been interested in collaborative note taking. That was a thing I studied.
Right.
Um, and but anyway, yeah, that's the thing I'd like to write about. I'd write more if I had something more to say, but
Hmm. Hmm.
at this point in my career, I'm mostly a digester and regurgitator, I
Yeah.
guess, rather than a new research. I'm not a researcher anymore, so
Right.
that's kind of problematic.
Right. Well, the good news is, if things go right, we will have a long time to do that. I got an email yesterday evening, this morning from my dad, who's 87, and
Oh, cool.
he was a high school teacher when I was a kid, and then
Yeah,
when I became an undergraduate, he went away and went to grad school at UC Davis and ended up lecturing there for quite a I don't know, a decade or
yeah.
whatever, and then retired from that, and now he's continuing to kind of, oh, thanks, Tim. He He's continuing to kind of write in journal and stuff, and
Yeah.
but he only sends it to me and my sister.
Oh,
But he was just sort of remarking this morning about kind of all the books, all the things that he has returned to, that he has read before or even taught before, and is kind of finding sort of new insights in which is
well,
kind of cool.
that's kind of been a reaction in this kind of professional, I don't know what I call now professional note taking, was this lament that I sure wish I had started doing this 30 years ago. Because I vaguely remember some things, that I wish I had access to,
Hmm.
and I had note taking systems. I kept notes on cards, but mostly that was to try to remember citations and stuff, and then there was EndNote. There's been a series of tools, but not, that's part of the thing I'm thinking about, and I think maybe you are too. What's the difference here? I mean, for me, it's partly between what's the difference between student note taking. That's what that little thing I wrote was about, to
Hmm.
some extent, and when I now, I don't know, for better want of a better label, would call professional note taking.
Hmm.
I mean, I think there's some really interesting questions there. And at what point do you start professionally note taking? I mean, does it mean you have to have a job?
Yeah. Right.
Or
Yeah. And
I
that
just think
that
those. I mean, that's interesting when we've had some of the very young people as part of this group that are starting to think about those things, at a time even starting a career as a student to some extent. I find that kind of interesting.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, I have a quick question to you, related to Zoom. I got talked into advising a student who's doing this thing called a dissertation in practice, which I'm not even sure I know for sure what it means. But anyway, and so she's UND has gone to a heavy emphasis on online stuff, and it's an interesting problem. I've decided because the student doesn't seem to be just completely lost, and I think part of that is she's not in a place where she has colleagues or the faculty. And I find myself in the same situation. She's got a remote professor and a remote student operating through a central entity, trying to communicate about the wishes of the central entity.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's got a clue, and we can't help each other because so they have this outline for this project, and it's like, okay, I supervised quite a few theses and dissertations, but they were all research. I don't understand the language, even since we talk about language. Like, what does it mean to have a theoretical basis for a dissertation in practice? I don't even know what are the options. If I even knew what the options are, I could maybe advise her.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting problem. And anyway, the question about Zoom is, like, when I connect to you or when I've taught, I've had an account through my institution. And for some reason, I don't know, I upgraded the system or the operating system and whatever. And all at once I seem to have lost that. So I'm trying to talk to her yesterday through Zoom, and it starts saying, well, you don't have a whatever kind of version, you need to pay money. It's like, I never had to pay money before. I mean, I don't know if the university handled that, or because I was thinking about your situation. I mean, and this is the same thing. I mean, I have connections with other professors who host Zoom kinds of things outside of their formal classwork. And there's never a problem with half an hour, or 2 hours of conversation.
Right.
So how does that work? How does the university take on
before
a licensing
Dan,
agreement they give you? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Before Dan gives the formal answer, Zoom will give you 40 minutes free at the moment.
Okay.
But what I do with the person that I'm conversing with as a one-on-one is I send them a link and they send me a link. So automatically, we've now got 2 lots of 40 minutes.
So you got 80 minutes. There you go. Yeah,
and when your second 40 minutes finishes, you go back to the first link and you've got another 40 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So there's workarounds. I didn't realize it was 40 minutes I had talked with her, but they were cutting me off. I'm thinking, this has never happened before.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
If you're the sender and it's not being controlled by somebody like Dan, you'll see a countdown in the top right-hand corner,
right,
of saying we've been running 8 minutes and 40 seconds now.
Yeah, okay.
But because Dan's paid account is giving us the link, at 40 minutes it doesn't stop, but it will for you if you haven't got a paid account.
Yeah, I actually, I mean, the reason that I bought my own Zoom instance was because I wanted to put these things on YouTube, and I figured that would not be really sort of within the I mean, I am not against using my institutional access for stuff like that, but in this case I thought, well, I want to own the copyright and then give it away.
Well, I must have ignored that distinction before, I guess. And I only ran into it because like I said, somehow I lost that, and when I tried to get a new account, when I tried to start a new instance that I installed, it called me on it.
Right. Yeah, that was the reason that I actually.
Are you still with the university, Mark?
I was just going to say hi, Eric. Maybe
my point is that you probably have a login that you need to use if you're still associated with the university.
Well, technically, I'm an emeritus. I mean, and in fact, I'm working with
Yeah,
the
then
students.
then their IT should help you just get back in.
Yeah, okay. That's what my wife said. She said, don't ask the administrators, just talk to IT.
Right.
Having worked in university IT in the past, wave the emeritus card and they'll help you.
All right. That's a good idea. Thanks.
Yeah. So I thought maybe, because we're starting a new book and because Eric is new, maybe we should just sort of introduce ourselves very briefly. And here comes John as well. So I am Dan Alasso. I teach history at a little university in northern Minnesota called Bemidji State for another, I don't know, 180-ish days. Because I've been retrenched, but I have good news. I am beginning to make a transition to doing open ed stuff for the entire system. So I think that is going to provide me sort of a path. Thank you, thank you, Chris. So that's kind of what I'm interested in sort of note making, research reading, writing. And I am going to try to update my own little, how to make notes and write and make it how to read, make notes and write is sort of a project that I'm sort of trying to pull to the front burner. So that's what I'm doing here. Who is next? I guess Tim, you appeared first on my screen, so you want to go next?
Okay. Well, I'm the flying the ointment as being the non-academic, or the least academic. The last time I was in university was 1984. Oh, not quite true. I did a 2010 lecture on what I do as an engineer. I'm the one here also that has refused to put pen to paper, as opposed to using my Obsidian access. And so my handwriting is going definitely downhill. So I shall start having to do something, if only to keep my better than most people's handwriting as an ex-draftsman. And along with a couple of other people here. In fact, I think everybody except Eric is been here from book one. If I remember rightly.
Yeah, close to it.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to see that Dan is not ill this week. Because I saw his lament about, I've got to do another video because I can't type.
Oh, I like videos. Although I have to type in order to do a video because otherwise I'm not a extemporaneous public speaker.
You have said before, yes, true. Be neither. So Mark was next, if I remember rightly. So Mark.
Okay. I've already basically provided the same background, but I'm a retired academic now for 7-8 years. I was an educational psychologist and I studied note-taking, reading, and some, did research in those kinds of areas. That's what I originally found the group, just, looking around the internet, and found the original, or one of the interests is note-taking, and I started attending, and just probably as much out of collegiality and having an interesting group to communicate with on Saturday mornings and keep me reading, I've continued. So that's I don't think I actually was here from the beginning because I think I missed the actual note-taking stuff. I found that stuff on YouTube and came in from that point on when we were studying history and philosophy and the economy and inequity and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It has. I mean, this is number 14, so I think you were there earlier rather than later. So who was next? I think probably Pat. You were next.
Yeah, Pat McNamara here. I'm a retired chemical engineer. Did chemical engineering things for large chemical companies. And the last 20 years of my career were in Washington, D.C. and government relations. So one of my current key interests is politics. Um, I haven't quite been here since the first, but I've been here for most of the discussions, and I find the viewpoints of interest and the books of interest. So I'll pass it off to Chris, I guess, next.
I don't know what the order is, but I'll go. I don't even know where to start these days. I'll start with where Tim did. My last university experience was Tuesday, because I'm taking a class in ring theory and modules, which is for 20 plus years I've been going over to UCLA has an extension program, and there's a professor who has decided he's going to teach upper level or graduate level math, random different new topics each quarter. So I've been doing that since 2006, which is the other half of the week that keeps my brain busy when Dan's not keeping it occupied. By study and trade, I'm a biomedical and electrical engineer. A few years ago, I built a device that injected the first stem cells into the first human patient's spinal cord for regenerative purposes. Something I actually learned about from my mom, who called me and said, "Oh, I saw this thing on CNN this morning." And it was like, the lab was supposed to tell me, because I had built it for lab animals, and I said, "I'll upgrade it for free when you decide to move to human patients." And the lab didn't say anything. So I found out from my mom, which was exciting. And as a side hobby, I've spent a lot of time in the intellectual history of note-taking methods and styles. So, and I will admit up front, it's probably maybe my fault. We're reading Graeber, so hopefully it's good.
Yep.
And then I think that that
means you're
Eric
up, Eric.
or John.
All right. So I'm Eric Sinclair. Trying to figure out when now that we've set the trade of where our last academic history was. I finished college in the late 80s. I haven't gone back, but I've done various sort of extension-y kind of things in the Chicago area, but not recently. So I think I'm probably somewhere between Chris and Tim in that regard. It's going to be my guess. I have my educational background was liberal arts. I was an English major in philosophy, but I've worked in IT for the last 30-ish years. Did a lot of time working with collaboration software, so stuff that became Microsoft Teams and the like for my sins. I use similar tools every day in my job, which has good and bad. But yeah, interested in note-taking, note-making. The rigor of my system is very poor. And so one of my subconscious goals was to try and improve the rigor by spending time in it, if that makes sense. So I live in the Chicago area, if that matters to anyone, and winter's coming. But you get it sooner up where you are, Dan.
Yeah. It's getting a little chilly up here. Yeah. And last but not least, John.
Hi, I'm John Wilkins. I live in the LA area, probably about 15 miles from Chris to the east. I'm a retired mathematics professor. I still teach a history of math online every spring, and which is kind of a broad field. It sounds like it's a narrow field, but it's a broad field because the mathematics is created within context, and I become more and more interested in the context, which is kind of what got me interested in all the books that we've been reading for this group. So I got initially I got hooked in by watching Dan's YouTube channel. That was very interesting. It had a great delivery, and that's how I started. I think I was in at the beginning. I'm not sure, but that's it.
Cool. Cool. Good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Noise. Okay. Yeah, I haven't noticed any noise from your side. Tim's actually. Are you in a coffee shop today, Tim? No. Okay. Sometimes Tim's in a coffee shop and there's background noise. But
And I was muted anyway.
So Graeber, I'm very happy to kind of be back on the Graeber bandwagon. I have this. I think we established that I don't have this book in every format because I don't have it in hardcover, but I do have it in audio and Kindle and paper. And I really enjoyed kind of going back to this and listening to it, and then over yesterday evening and this morning, kind of going through the highlights that I've got in Kindle, and I'm really sort of fascinated, John, based on kind of what you were saying. It does seem like this. One of the things that's really interesting is this, skills and techniques, math, writing, all of this stuff that has to kind of come into existence and be sort of created in order to facilitate this stuff, and and to kind of connect that along the lines of sort of the things that Chris is interested in. It seems like because we've talked a lot in the past about sort of a transition from internal memory knowledge and kind of very sort of subjective in relationships with ideas and understanding, to something that is external and objective, like written notes on a clay tablet or things like that. So it struck me that's kind of an interesting social element of kind of what is going on at the beginning of economics. But what did so we read the first 3 chapters. What were people's initial thoughts about kind of the opening and the way that Graeber introduces all this stuff?
I was, as I said in the community chat on Obsidian, I'm just glad we're back with a book with footnotes and endnotes and proper bibliography.
Yeah.
And the same with the 3.5-ish economics type focused books we've done. I'm just continue to be amazed at what I don't know. So the language is going to prove a problem, not just because it's an American in Britain who's obviously halfway through his translations. And there was, very early on, there was a quote of a story that I quite liked, which was Jean-Claude Galli's encounter with the Eastern Himalaya bit in the 70s, where he's talking about the culture of the creditors and the debtors, and the way that you pay for your daughter's wedding by pimping for your daughter.
Yeah.
Which I thought was somewhat odd, but then thinking about all the immigrant waves of people we're supposedly having in Europe, and particularly in the UK, and obviously other places around the world, it doesn't sound quite so far-fetched, given seeing Zanny's not made it. The other standard program we're supposed to quote every time, as in The Wire season 2, with the container full of women that gets suffocated because of
the obligatory
not playing balls
reference.
Yeah. So, and there isn't quite the West Wing quotable line for that, other than it's nice when you can help prostitutes, isn't it? Says Jed to Leo. So I like the way, particularly chapter 1, goes through the book as a proper intro, just as opposed to here are the ideas, but I'm not telling you where they're coming or what or why the sequence. Right? So I like those intros that are a very short introduction type equivalent to the subject, because it just seems to be a much more honest way of building a non-fiction book. So
There is
start, I think.
There is a lot of kind of particularity and peculiarity sometimes in this. I didn't feel it as much in the first chapter because I kind of liked the way that he sort of eased into the theoretical thing, from his personal experiences, both in this cocktail situation, where I think it was interesting, that to just that one paragraph, when he says where to start, and he says I could have, and the whole idea of contextualizing stuff. One of the things that I did, that as kind of I went through the first 3 chapters that I wondered about is sort of this idea of sort of peculiar particulars that anthropologists find in field research, and how much, I guess I started asking myself, well, is this one too far? Is this close enough to sort of what he's talking about here that it kind of makes sense to me, or at some point am I gonna start feeling that this has gone a little bit over over the line, and I think that we had not to get outside of the of this text, I think we had a similar kind of reaction in some spots, or I did, to Dawn of Everything. So the idea, but I think kind of the basic ideas, especially this one that he kind of begins with about the difference between obligation and debt, was really fascinating.
Well, I think what struck me is, and it happened in mathematics in the early 1900s, mathematicians went back and kind of historically put math on a better foundational footing by delving into set theory and creating set theory as a basis for the field going forward. And here he's kind of nudging at the same thing, and give me a second, I gotta go. There's a small emergency I gotta go take care of.
Okay. So yeah, it did, to not to hijack where he's going to go with it, but in the meantime, this idea of things, of all of this stuff, all these ways of thinking and words for thinking, like reckoning and redemption and all of that kind of come into our for me, probably the third chapter and the discussion or the argument about the culture and sort of the religious elements are much less straightforward than the economics was clearly wrong about this, and they clearly were myth making. And Chris did mention in the chat. And Eric, we tend to have the chat open so that people can kind of sort of make side comments as we go. That we do tend to focus on myths and myth busting throughout a lot of what we. That's a theme.
The other thing I would say, given sort of Chris has done a bit a lead in and you've added to, I thought the language element of the particularly of the third chapter started to build very well, and as I say, it's not a subject I particularly touched on, either anthropology or economics, and it's been increasingly noticeable, just to support what I said to say early on, was we've come so used to using, I want a credit card or I want a bit of credit, and it's of no consequence in some respects. And yet, where did it come from? How did we get to here? And we found that in terms of particularly Graeber's original book, with, you know, how is it possible that this illiterate, unchristian, uncivilized savage could debate us Jesuits so well? Right? And so in theory, he doesn't have the language. In theory, he doesn't have the background of debating techniques, etc. And there was somewhere, since we last met, that was poo-pooing the education of how to debate as a sport, rather like you see in the Denzel Washington film, The Debaters or something, where it doesn't matter which side's right, you're there to win the game.
Right.
And so there's an element of that, but it was the language thing of the creation of a language. And I'm outside of Shakespeare, you know, as in a pound of flesh from our sort of resident of Venice, etc. So that one is clear and old hat. And thank you to Al Pacino for playing Shylock so well, etc.
Yeah. Well, and I was reminded of this, right? Because I did my write-up of chapter 8 this morning for the other website, and it was the one about coming to terms, right? And you know, and so they go on and on about the whole, you know, the idea of terminology, and you know, so what you're saying, you know, Tim, you know, how does Candiaronk kind of insert himself into this, you know, in this terminology debate, right, about freedom and on, you know, and personal liberty and all that stuff. Interesting that that was able to kind of happen. One of the things that did strike me about this was sort of that idea, you know, as you move from obligation, which we sort of understand, to debt, which we sort of understand differently. What's going on there? You know, I mean, he mentions on, I don't have page numbers on my Kindle right here, so it's hard for me to tell, but you know, if one owes a favor or one's life to another human being, it's owed to that person specifically. But if one owes $40,000 at 12%, it doesn't really matter, right? So there's an element of sort of objectifying and depersonalizing that's going on here. He later says that currency, you know, that the advantage of currency is that it's endlessly sort of subdividable. The analogous thing on the debt side might be transferable or endorsable.
You know, I how to read a book came to mind as well, partly because, you know, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't follow any of that. I said, okay, we got 3 chapters to read for this book, and I start reading. And that provides a lack of context, a lack of goals to some extent. I'd like to know where this is all going. Maybe those of you more familiar with the author have an insight. Like, am I going to end up being really concerned or less concerned about the national debt because I've read this, you know, that so the debt isn't something really to worry about. It's just something that, you know, will eventually somehow take care of itself, or it's all imaginary anyway. It's just a matter of trust, etc.
Well, I think there are I'm
That's what I'm saying. Are there implications here that you are aware of because you know how this author writes, or because you've applied a different strategy to gain an oversight, an overview of the whole point of this book, if there is a point.
Well,
that has-
I think he sort of telegraphs that in that first little vignette of himself talking to the lady at the cocktail hour, that he thinks that the way we've set these systems up is very arbitrary and is very much designed to benefit the IMF and and kind of the ruling class, and that it needs to be dismantled, and those debts need to be repudiated. It's less clear to me. So I think that from his kind of longtime anarchist, agitator sort of perspective is where you would expect him to go. Less clear to me, honestly, and I am looking forward to kind of rereading it and trying to figure it out in my own head, what that means for nations, and especially the U.S. and China and things like that, right? Because he does mention even this early in the first couple of chapters here, he does mention that that the idea that and he uses that epigram about how if you owe $100,000 to the bank, they own you, but if you own 100 million,
have you read
you own the bank.
Economic Hitman or something like that? There's a book roughly by that title.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Seems very similar in at least where I thought, I've read that book. So, the intent of the egregiousness of the way countries, make other countries dependent upon them, partly because of their commitment to or obligations, however you want to think of it, to the debt they've accumulated. And that's a manipulative political strategy as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that is gonna kind of play out as you would expect it to. I'm not, like I said, I'm not as sure, because I think you could argue that I think it's Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You could argue that we will never need to repay, that we shouldn't be worried about China and about all of the debt, all of the government, bonds that China holds, because there's no possibility that they can ever call them, right, and that they can ever sort of force us. I think that the bigger danger is that they would cut off that line of credit, but demanding demanding repayment and being able to enforce it, I think is problematic, and does suggest that it's maybe more like tribute than a loan. What that actually means, I'm not sure. I am looking forward to kind of trying to decode that and figure that out in the context of Graeber's thinking. I'm not entirely sure that that everything that he thinks scales, right? And that's one of the things that I think we'll be talking about in the course of reading this book is his idea that oftentimes things don't scale, right? And that you have that you have communism at the family level, and and different types of organization, and different types of liberality or conservatism in political thinking at different levels of scale. And that I'll be interested to see how that plays out too.
So here's a good spot to jump back into the analogy I was making to the foundations of math in the early 1900s. So he's essentially looking at one of the foundational myths of economics as a scientific field. And at the time a lot of this stuff was going on, physics was doing so incredibly well because it was done on a scientific footing. So every field and their brother tried to go back and look at how can we do for our field what physics is doing in their space. And it caused problems in lots of academic areas at the time, certainly. But he's looking at the same type of foundational myths that Kate Rayworth mentioned in Donut Economics. There's economics is this fun and interesting place, and if you study at university, there's a lot of math involved, so it seems like it's heavy stuff. But as people like Kahneman and Tversky have come around to show us that there's a lot of kind of dirty, muddy water going on, and it's not just this clockwork universe that Newton tried to ascribe to everything. So some of it is, I think some of his point is, let's look back at the foundations of where we started and where we came from. And he doesn't come out and say it, but there is he does mention the divine providence and the hand of God as the invisible hand. So Smith is certainly writing at a time where there is still a fair amount of scholasticism and church married into the educational system that to a great extent has been split out now, and we've gotten rid of some of the at least problematic parts of what religion throws into the educational system. But to go back to that math analogy, by putting math on a basis using set theory, it allowed Gödel to come along in the 20s and say, even if you have this logical foundation, there's still the chance that you could have, things that don't logically fit into the system, and it could cause problems. And so we need to be aware of what's going on essentially when these problems could surface and throw the math way off course. And so you still even today have a lot of textbooks that will split themselves into things that deal with finite subjects and things that deal with infinite subjects. And you have to be super careful, especially at the higher reaches of math, when you're splitting those differences, because you'll run into problems. And I think in some sense, he may be implying it, but he's certainly not made the point directly. But if we have been basing our ideas on, this version of economics that you mentioned a few minutes ago, Dan, it's what kind of problems could that lead us into? And should we have a better foundation? And because we have a better foundation, then that may lead us to potentially a better space. But it also, as you were talking too, it reminded me of, I'd mentioned the Heinrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World. And since roughly the 1500s, he makes the argument that the world is going from kind of a group or a tribal structure into smaller, tiny family units that are more dramatically disconnected, which is what economics has pushed us to, is that, hey, who's the debt to? Is it to the society? Is it to the government? Is it to your neighbor? And in that framing of the weirdest people of the world, where if I remember, it's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democracy, I think, are the big things. Is that pushing us, is economics pushing us more towards that versus a more holistic world where we would care about, as an individual, it's harder to care about the bigger world and things like climate crisis if you're just an individual person. But if you feel like you're part of a bigger collective whole, it's a whole lot easier to do that. So there's a bunch of kind of weird, quirky things going on with what he's saying here, even with things we've read recently.
No, I think it all fits together. And one of the and to drag it back to this again, I think the idea of terminology, right? I mean, economics of all of the fields that I've studied, I think has been the one, and maybe that's partially why I mentioned in the chat that I'm sort of suspicious of anthropology and sociology oftentimes, and often it's because I think that they are not as respectful of contingency, and they're much more happy to very quickly generalize. And economics, I guess, is my model of that from my own experience. Because my undergraduate, was that I think that it's so easy to, have something that's complicated, have terminology that's described, in sentences or paragraphs, and then create a placeholder, a word like capitalism or democracy, right, or free markets, right, and forget all of the caveats and conditions and assumptions that kind of go with that, and then when we use the word as shorthand, and then it gets increasingly, and then I often wonder how, at what point that accidental misunderstanding becomes, deliberate rhetorical manipulation in politics. So, and when he observes, that we're moving back towards the restoration of things like debtor prisons, then it seems like there's a whole kind of political overlay that probably deliberately restricts the scope of our discussion and the ability to actually come to terms. So, Mark, you call this a hypothetical construct. Yeah, I mean, and
well, that's the point. I mean, you're talking about kind of this notion of reductionism.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, I don't know, that's what I always called it, that you haven't really done anything until you can explain it at the very basic level. And if you're in, well, so psychology, I think is, you didn't include that in your list of things you question, like anthropology and whatever, but there's many mechanisms that we use as kind of a shorthand to avoid getting to first principles or actual causes or whatever you want to think of it as, assuming that, well, someday somebody in biology will figure that out, but we're not going to wait that long to test ideas or something of that nature. And I don't know if that's what economists do, but so I just from personal experience, I'm willing to say that sometimes, I understand the limits too, but there are ways to try to make progress, even if you aren't going to believe you have to make it by explaining, kind of physics and biology.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it was interesting how Adler and Van Doren, kind of distinguished between, and they talked about like William James, I guess, right? And they were talking about the idea that, well, okay, some people, Freud's insights come from, repeatable, psychoanalytic things, but James, sort of like a philosopher, like they say a philosopher does, refers to everyday experience and tries to kind of build a bridge that way. I guess one of the things that strikes me is is that ability to kind of or that desire to kind of generalize and and what what peculiarities and what contingencies kind of fall away as we kind of do that. I do think that the generalizations that he attacks in the second chapter, the kind of myth, the myth of barter thing, are interesting and aren't entirely original, but I think he does a really good job of describing them in this case. And the idea that money, but the thing, in trying to think of, what it is that, sort of in the context of this bigger theme that he's talking about of sort of discrete personal relationships being abstracted, as you were saying, Mark, into something that can be, because that I mean, as when I was studying economics, that was the one thing that really kind of struck me, was that as they understand, market exchange, when those, when the supply curve and the demand curve intersect, right, you have by definition, it is a one-off, impersonal, and calculation and decision in which no other factors are relevant, right? So there's no relationship, right? There's no, I mean, you meet for a moment at the market, you do this transaction, and then you walk away, never to be, and all of those assumptions kind of go into the determination of value, right? And so as part, in part of doing this, especially when he's talking about Adam Smith, I think it's important that Adam Smith didn't think of himself in that way, right? Adam Smith thought, he did sort of lead to this idea that there is this providential invisible hand kind of thing going on, but that it also happens within some type of bigger world of values, right? The theory of moral sentiments, right? I mean, there are all kinds of other value systems, aesthetic ones, moral ones, whatever, that are set aside by economics and then permanently become set aside in economic history, and they forget that they even exist.
Or even entertainment. I mean, I've heard in the last 2 weeks an anecdotal story of someone who was visiting the Middle East with a friend, and her friend took her to kind of an open air market, and they sat and, went back and forth negotiating the price of something for 20, 30 minutes. And then, they were running out of time. So they went to, 3 stalls down, and her friend totally short-circuited the 40 minutes of negotiating the price, and down to the pennies, just said, "What's your best price?" The person said it. She offered something slightly less because I'm done. And they bought the thing in a minute and left.
Right.
And, her friend who wasn't in the culture said, "What was that? Like, how does that work?" And she says, "Well, sometimes," she's like, "people as entertainment enjoy doing the negotiating and the posturing and the crazy. But, sometimes you just don't have time for that. And you need the transaction, and you move on and you go."
Yeah, that was one of the things we read. I remember that distinctly. Yeah, that's a great story.
And he kind of touches a little on that of what's the personal interaction. But then when you put that into a capitalistic system where you need to improve your throughput, you never have time for that entertainment of negotiation. So you just get to it. And culturally, that's dramatically different across cultures. So it happens in the Middle East or in Japan. They'll never, culturally, they hate making the decision in the room. So you'll have 10 meetings to discuss all the problems before ultimately someone makes a decision outside of the room, and then you're told what the decision is. But when you have to, increase your productivity, you don't have the time for that. And similarly, in some countries, all the products are in cupboards and hidden away. So you have to ask for the thing, and the shopkeeper has to bring it out and show it to you.
Right.
And the amount of time and effort and energy it takes to do that would never fly in the United States. So you have to rely on the trust of the customer not to take the thing off the shelf and walk out of the door with it. Or you have to figure out who pays for that and how. And then suddenly you've got words like breakage, which,
or shrinkage.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Or
I would think
shrinkage or-
in Chicago, there's an overreaction along those lines within the pharmacies, where many products are now locked up, and you have to request a person. I assume this is in other large cities, but you have to request a person. And Walgreens recently remodeled one of their stores in the Loop so that there's nothing available on the shelves. And it is like the old school market where you have to tell the person, "I would like a bottle of Tegrin shampoo," or whatever the product is. And they go get it for you and bring it, which is...
Yeah. In Los Angeles, it's become a thing now in especially grocery stores that had drugstore aisles. They've literally made a mini store inside the grocery store.
Yeah.
And if you pick things off of those shelves, you have to pay for them before you leave that area and go back to the grocery store physically. Yes.
So it's like the liquor market within the grocery stores of Indiana.
Yeah.
Right? They're open separate hours and have different regulations.
Mhm.
But when you think about the efficiency of those systems, they're horrible. But because the economics of theft have gotten so bad for those categories, they're
or perceived economics of theft, right? I mean, CVS walked back their shrinkage statements last year. They said, well, we have this huge percentage of shrinkage, and then they went back and they apparently looked at the numbers and were wrong, right? They spent far more on security than they gained in the product. But
well, especially at their margins, yeah, you would imagine.
Yeah, right. But it makes me think of the social interaction of that old style of market, right? Where you're waiting for the shopkeeper. So you're interacting with your other members of the community. You're interacting with the shopkeeper about the product. We don't get that in the current state where it's like, give me the Tegrin, here's the Tegrin, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that Tegrin is still made. I don't know why I'm using that as an example.
The one that I think is funny with versus listing of different cultures and different attitudes in the Middle East thing. In most instances, you other 5 people, 6 people are in the US, and I would assume a reasonable span of states where there's open carry and concealed carry licensing for firearms. Yet, in theory, you don't have a problem with being a customer in the shop, having a customer in the shop with a firearm with them when they're shopping. And here, well, UAE is slightly different because unless you're a local, you're not going to be able to get a license to carry at all, let alone to own. But there's some places I've been to, the guy's walked into a shop to say, I want to buy a bag of rice, and he's got a Kalashnikov over his shoulder. What are you going to negotiate? And it's like, well, that's fine, no problem, because I've got 3 Kalashnikovs underneath the counter. It almost starts to look like that early scene when we first meet Arnie in Terminator 1. He's listing out the firearms he wants, and the guy turns around and says, if it's not on the wall, we don't have it, sort of thing. But you go in other places, and you go to somewhere in Jeddah or Riyadh, and the gold merchant's going to go for a restroom visit or a lunch break, and they close the door by putting a gold chain across the doorway and walk away. Because the risk is just too high to losing your hand. So, albeit it's now done surgically. It's now done surgically as opposed to just put it on the block son and we're off with assault. But
that's much more civilized.
Sadly, it hasn't escaped the boardroom in the gun manufacturing space. But when it comes to efficiency versus safety, I will say that I have been in an executive room at Remington Arms with 20 executives who are looking at a new gun, and it will be passed around the table. And I swear to you, every person who picked up and held the gun, the first thing they did was check to see if it was loaded before they did anything else with it.
Sure.
And then they would pass it along, they would check. But the problem is, even though that's stupidly inefficient for a boardroom, it's company policy and they do it, and that's just how it works. But sadly, that company policy on safety doesn't leave the 4 walls of the company to the rest of the world. And for marketing purposes, they don't push that either, which I always found to be kind of a lot disingenuous.
So the 2-year-old kills the purchaser occasionally.
Yeah.
But, and I know even in the Walmarts, I've never seen the clerk behind the counter popped the gun open to see was it loaded before they handed it across the counter to.
Oh, I do have that experience. I mean, I bought mine at the Fleet store, so it's not quite Walmart. It's not as I mean the lowest common denominator, but yeah, they're very careful about ejecting the clip and and pulling it back, to and handing it over in that status. So yeah, one of the things that also kind of struck me in this was that all of this stuff that we're talking about, so far is still kind of involves keeping score. And I think that that in the section where he's talking, and it kind of reminded me that this is, that this may have been, this was before dawn of everything, and it may have sort of led to him sort of looking more closely at the Iroquois. He mentions, Lewis Henry Morgan describing the Iroquois and describing how, how they don't really have what we're talking about. They don't really have scorekeeping, right? They have, longhouses where, women distribute everything, and not based on the same type of account keeping. So it's not like, well, okay, they just, keep track of it in their heads. They have account books, but it's mental. It's just sort of not even really kind of the same sort of account book mindset, right? That, oh, he brought in a buck that, that had, 200 pounds of meat on it. So, so he or his family are entitled to X, Y, and Z down the line until they've exhausted that credit. And then they need, then he needs to go back and get another deer or elk or something.
One of the things I see looming on the horizon that we may come to, and it's a very, an enlightened anthropologist point of view, which I think he probably takes, and it's going to be a subtle message just from kind of my inspectional read and knowing who Graeber is and what he's talking about in general. And it's shifted from early anthropology in the early 20th century to now. But there's this idea of cultural anthropology and respecting the fact that other cultures do things differently. And you can't say the way China does it is better than Japan, is better than, what's happening in Namibia, as an example. But in general, in most of the modern West, our economic system is incredibly monoculture and in moving in only one direction, and subsuming more and more places as it goes. So the economic system we're using then becomes forced on the economic systems that other countries and other places are using. And in his example, he throws out what's happening in amongst the Malagasy when the French take over as a small example within his experience.
Right.
But watch what's going on. He's giving us examples of how economies and ideas of debt work across a broad array of cultures and places and time periods in history. Yeah. And in some sense, it's okay, crazy Westerners who are doing it this single monoculture way. Here are a bunch of examples of how economics could work in your setting, or you could shift and do something else that doesn't create toxic, mobster-like entities like the IMF.
Mm-hmm.
And there is not that there's a better way, but there at least are other ways. And if you don't know that there are other ways, how are you going to explore that fact? So he is starting the book by hitting the basic foundations of economics and saying, we've built this edifice on Smith, who started a conversation, and he's continuing part of the great conversation by looking at that and saying, there's some issues here. But so let's look at what's happening everywhere else and look at a broader history. so we can walk up to the smorgasbord of economic ideas and pick things that may be better or healthier for who we are right now.
Right.
And to me, I think
it's a bit like
that may be the overarching goal of the book, at least from my quick.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right, and I think that he continues that in with Wengrow and Dawn of Everything, right? That this thing that the crazy Westerners have was not inevitable, and it's not the only way. And so so here, and here, there are examples of other ways of organizing, social relations. Yeah.
it's a bit like Chris's earlier example of the Japanese bargaining, as in 10, 25 meetings, the decision gets made out of the room, and then the last meeting gets told the answer. And the one that I think is similar and harks back to the book, maybe in a slightly different way, is the other versions of debt and credit that is not just pure money, as in favors. Mm-hmm. And the Japanese have a ranking system of, if I ask you a favor, then at some point down the line, you get to ask one back. And it's a bit sort of like working men's clubs for Christmas expenditures and stuff. You buy, in effect, a 1 shilling share. You need to borrow some money from that club. You then start paying 2 shillings for your share each week until you've paid it back with a little bit of interest. It always goes back to a bank account savings as well. So the bank interest is added. And then 2 weeks before Christmas, in the UK at least, a load of men with pickaxe handles line the road between the bank and the working men's club, and they move 2 million in cash, but not just 2 million in cash, but 2 million in cash in the right numbers of each notes and coins, so that the people can come and collect their Christmas bonus, as it were, a couple of weeks before Christmas. So he hasn't said much about banks overall in any particular detail yet. But he's sort of touched upon cooperatives, and he's not quite touched on other forms of banking yet, to say, here's the diversity of a possible ecosystem. And I find it a bit more interesting in some respects about the use of things like monoculture as a phrase for these things that are most definitely not agriculture. Such that you can have, agriculture and monoculture as a word has sort of left agriculture or even horticulture, and has now been sort of let go into the wider world to mean things of complexity and diversity at some level. So again, it comes back down to what's the word, what do we understand by the word, and somebody's bound to then turn around and say Humpty Dumpty and Alice in Wonderland. Mm-hmm. So, and I know partly because of writing so much and being a bit more interested in the actual which words do we put in which order type stuff. And most of us have learned English from our grandmother's apron sort of thing. We don't automatically challenge or wonder why, but we know why giant green fire-breathing dragons is correct, but fire-breathing green giant dragons is not correct. Because there's a particular word order for all those things. And most of us English first language people don't learn the rule. Of course, being surrounded by English is not our first language, or second, or third, or fourth in many instances, I'm constantly being asked what's the rule, and I have to look it up every time. So the where the word comes from, which has already been shown to be important in this book, and it's not about, it's quite a few pages, but it's not about, it's not a doorstop like, you know, the story of everything.
Yeah. Well,
So it's a good one.
yeah.
One of the things that strikes me too is an interesting analogy in looking at some of these beginnings and like early philosophies of how different cultures are viewing, you know, economics or debt. So even like delving into the Rig Veda as a method of having a conversation with history and economics and debt just is just a phenomenal place to start.
Yeah.
But it also reminds me too of those early origin stories that we tell ourselves as people and as a culture can dramatically shift where we end up. It reminded me of chapter 1 of Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. She tells an Earth origin story about Sky Woman and how the Earth was created in at least the framing of that indigenous culture. And that origin story is dramatically different than the Adam and Eve origin story that a lot of the West uses as its, you know, pinning. And when you look at the two and you compare them and think about them in juxtaposition to each other, what those stories say, what the roots are, and where we are now, you can immediately see where things branched off and where they either went right or went wrong, you know, in a comparative way. And not even to say one is right and one is wrong. Certainly one has taken off to a great extent, you know, in the way that, let's say, corn is evolutionarily, you know, much larger in size than the green bean is, which is, you know, a pitiful, paltry little, like, why is that even still here? It should all just be corn, right? And by that, I'm drawing direct analogy to corn as, you know, the U.S. banking system and way of doing things, and green beans as any other culture.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to see that as, you know, and if you don't look at the roots of how did we get here, which is why he takes I think a hard bash at Adam Smith, is we could be doing something better, certainly. And if we're going to treat this economics as a science, particularly in an age where almost every academic subject is multidisciplinary, then let's look at history and actual examples so that we can get rid of the mythology that has been trailing us along all this time, because the mythology is probably hurting us.
Right. Well, and also the psychology that had been that was assumed that, you know, that as you mentioned, you know, Kahneman and Tversky kind of challenged. It's weird along the way, and in this primordial debt chapter, he does mention that that Smith did sort of deliberately ignore, for his own political reasons, the role of government in mercantilism, which is, I mean, mercantilism is all about government. So that interested me quite a bit. The other things that kind of jumped out at me that I think just are things that I should like carve on a stone and remind myself of, you know, kind of on a regular basis, are this idea that a lot of debt only works if it is never paid.
Mhm.
right? I mean, then there's a lot of examples of that at a kind of a micro and macro and economic and social level, right? But the Bank of England certainly one of them. But also this idea that a coin also is an IOU. It's just a different type of IOU. So it's really all debt because you can't eat a coin, right? It's a promise, it's a social expectation that somebody else will take a coin. That was one of the things that really there was a guy, a historian, who wrote really kind of the only major book that everybody cites. His name is Stephen Mihm, M-I-H-M, and he wrote a book about counterfeiters. And he tried to explain the pre-national banking, the pre-Lincoln administration National Banking Acts of 1862 as this sort of crazy, chaotic Wild West where you couldn't trust, all banks were issuing their own notes and you couldn't trust it. And it was, and everybody was afraid of counterfeiting. And that's why we have the Secret Service and all that kind of stuff, which is really a very kind of tortured argument. And I sort of went out of my way to attack it in my own book, but that sort of idea that even, and he even sort of undermines his own argument by saying, well, the guy who was the head of the Secret Service, who wrote a kind of a memoir about this, said, well, oftentimes you would have people more willing to take the notes of a known kind of shady bank than those of a less known but very substantial and creditworthy bank, entirely on the basis of the expectation that the person who's taking the note had that I can turn around and I can hand this off to somebody else, right? So it's not so much about the idea of creditworthiness as the idea of currency. And that actually also kind of strikes me as something interesting in this whole train of thought. That even in a corrupt situation, as long as the ball keeps moving.
Well, what happens too, and I'll ask you as the open educator, because there's a great quote, I think it's Benjamin Franklin of, he's talking about knowledge, and he essentially says, I can light your candle without dimming my own by passing knowledge on to you. And so within an academic sphere, both to follow the train of thought and be able to do things like Graeber's doing here to attack the basics, you need to be able to follow back that train of, that note that's got 57 signatures on it that's been traveling around the city and relying on its truth, its truth. So if I take my note card with my notes and hand them on to you, hopefully they're footnoted well enough that you can trace it back to double check that truth. So there is not just a monetary economy, but there's an intellectual and information economy. And who's that information economy seems to be doing incredibly well, although there's a lot of bad debt out there. But what does comparing the one to the other look like? Mm-hmm. Or what is the driving force of the information economy that seems to never let it slow down versus the money economy, which has fits and spurts, and, near misses and things like, Black Tuesday, Black Monday, 2008 financial crashes. Where do those, how do those two economies, how are they the same? How are they different? And what's the driving motor behind it? Or is there, as Kate Rayworth would say, that there's a motor pushing it all in one and not in the other? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, one of the things to remember about Ben Franklin was that he was also a printer, right? And so he profited, as did, you know, other people like Isaiah Thomas in Worcester profited unbelievably from reprinting English publications where copyright couldn't be enforced. Right. So at the time that, you know, in 1800, right, there's no effective way to enforce copyright. So, I mean, and that's why, you know, that's why Dickens, you know, did his American tours and stuff, because even in his day, right, he was, you know, so much of his work was being pirated that he figured the only way that he could, you know, that he could benefit from it was if he actually went on a speaking tour. So there's, you know, so and I do think that Cory Doctorow and Jaron Lanier do have some, you know, some relevant points to make about the, you know, the whole information wants to be free, and you know, and the idea of sharing, and I mean, and Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer were all over that whole idea of, you know, be a dandelion, right? And you know, and just put it out there, and good things will happen, you know, karmically or something like that, which is a very optimistic way of thinking about it. But, you know, maybe it's easier to be an optimist when you're Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer.
Until you get
I wanted to go back. Oh, sorry, Eric.
No, nothing. I was making a snarky comment.
I wanted to go back to something that stuck out to me was about how debt wasn't even understood very well. And I've been reading Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. She's a monetary theorist and was a chief economist to the Senate committee under, well, she was invited in by Bernie Sanders. But she tells a story that she asked members on the committee, separately, of course, if you had a magic wand, would you wipe out the national debt? And without exception, they all said yes. Then she said, second question, if you had a magic wand, you could wipe out treasury bills. Would you do it? And they really didn't know what to say. But it shows that the lack of understanding of what the debt is.
Right.
And that if you look at debt as overspending, you only see one side of the ledger, that there's money that goes into the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, when she shows a correlation between government's various administrations' efforts to get a balanced budget, so zero deficit, and the debt doesn't grow, you had an economic crash within a year or two. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really, I think the whole idea, and I don't have it, I don't want to misrepresent myself. I don't have it really entirely firm in my mind, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to kind of return to this and think about it some more, was, you know, this idea that value is created by monetizing debt. And the example that he gives is this idea of the, you know, Henry and the Bank of England. But the same sort of logic applies to, you know, a local savings bank, more, you know, financing a house purchase, right, with a mortgage, right? You create, you know, I want to buy a house for $250,000. $250,000 is created in that transaction, and that is, I mean, I guess there's a way of saying, well, that value existed and it's just being monetized. That value existed in the economy, you know, the house, the land, whatever, the sticks and rocks that I put together to build a house, you know, create that, you know, are the actual value, and it's represented by money. But even so, it enters the economy in this way, right? And so so that's one of the things in history that really, really fascinates me, and that I think that is not well understood, is this moment that that I've been harping on for so long about the Lincoln administration and the destruction of state banking for the purpose of creating a national banking system and and a national currency, the greenback, and and financing the Civil War. But that I think a big part of it, and I think that it even predates that. I think it goes back to I think there was an event. There was a thing called the Sussex Bank Crisis in Massachusetts history, and it had to do, I think, and I think it really illustrates the fact that bankers in the East, in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, and the original money centers of American history, looked westward, and especially after the Treaty of Paris in 1783, when they saw the West. I mean, the Treaty of Paris, Britain gave us all of that territory that they claimed all the way to the Mississippi, right? So even before the Louisiana Purchase, right, there's this huge chunk of the continent. And they did it, according to some historians, primarily to get us in trouble, right? That we would overextend ourselves and the Union would fall apart. But I think that that's an interesting story. But the thing that happened to the bankers was, I think they looked west and they saw all of this land, and it scared them completely to death, right? That they were going to become so irrelevant in the national economy because there was going to be all of this additional value that was going to be created. And actually Chicago was a great example of that, right? Because in the 1830s, when Chicago, I mean, there's this huge speculation bubble in Chicago, and property values rise in the 1830s higher than they are in New York City, right? And then of course they crash and it all goes away. But this idea that there is going to be so much value created in the West. And so what do we do as a national economy to keep control in the East? We prevent banks from writing mortgages on real property. And I'm not probably describing that very well, but this is something that's been kind of rattling around my head that I think some historian should really chase after.
Well, that was the shocking thing to me, was the revelation of what the Wizard of Oz was really about, which makes me wonder, what are the, like 5 or 6 books after that, are those economic history lessons, and that's why they didn't do so well, as the underlying story wasn't as exciting or gripping. But yeah, I had read that and I was like, oh, he could have made that up as a conspiracy theory, and I'm all in on it because it all fits so incredibly well. Like, that's the best conspiracy theory I've ever seen pop up ever.
Yeah.
And I'd heard that before, but not, it was more resonant in context of where Graeber places it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and the idea that I mean, that's another thing that really interests me, is the idea that these populists and these people who nowadays we look back on, and Thomas Frank writes about, and we think of, and he says that they're not as simple and straightforward and dumb as we might believe they are, but that really there's much more going on in this resistance movement than just, we want silver, damn it, to inflate the currency. So it seems like there's a whole, not hidden but ignored history there of much more sort of nuance and complex argumentation going on than what it's been portrayed as. And that, and probably actually the whole Cross of Gold speech and that whole hijacking of the populist platform by the Democratic Party in the campaigns of that particular politician was maybe the worst thing that could happen. Keynes. Banks create money and there's no intrinsic limit to their ability to do so. However much money they lend, the borrower will have no choice but to put it back into some bank.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great scam. I don't know if we're gonna, if by the time we finish talking about all of this, we'll have the solution for blockchain and Bitcoin and exchanges, and how to avoid scamming and all of that.
I think it takes
Well,
more
that
than
and that's the big thing with Bankman-Fried this last like 2 weeks is, you know, Bitcoin, I think already in the zeitgeist had already like quieted down a little bit because I think some of the fad has gone away, but this is almost like the nail in the coffin that's going to kill all the rest, I think.
Mm.
Mhm.
And then we've all obviously moved on to the new AI fad. So
Yeah. Eric, what were you going to throw in?
I was going to say, I think there's going to be less external money floating into it, but I think I think Bitcoin as a blockchain is going to continue to try to find purpose.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think
I also tried to draw a distinction between the financial intersections, right, where it joins to the fiat,
yep,
and where you can make scam money or real money, depending on how you look at it, versus, a way of thinking about the ledger, which comes back to, I think, where we sort of started this morning, right? Blockchain is a ledger, debt and economics was sort of one of the reasons for the ledger to exist.
Right, but not the only one. So maybe that's where it will be more effective is, because I think that nowadays, especially given, what we've seen happening with, not only surveillance technology and surveillance capitalism, but now, all this social media stuff that we're seeing, coming up, and all these revelations, a decentralized ledger sounds increasingly valuable. And it can respond to, and it can memorialize a whole lot of additional things beyond just financial transactions.
If the cost, which intersects with the economic system, of producing and maintaining that ledger can be manageable. I mean, that's the other challenge of Bitcoin and other blockchain technologies, is that as they get longer and larger and more complex, the amount of computation required grows.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're, damming rivers to do a ledger.
Yeah. It does seem like I wonder, because I don't understand that completely, but I do wonder whether that's inevitable or whether that is a set of requirements that has been established in order to create right. An extreme cost.
I don't know that it's been, I think that it is, I'm not very familiar, but my understanding is that there are differing approaches, some of which reduce the cost substantially.
Yeah, hope that's true.
But do they, on the other hand, to Chris's point, right? The amount of computation required for simple output, but complex creation, AI tools,
mm-hmm.
is astounding.
So the premise behind the Fight Club would be the Project Mayhem part of it, or just generally?
Well, I don't want to be the spoiler, but the building they were trying to blow up was, essentially the building that held all the credit card records for most of the country. And if you take that out and if there's no backups, then all the debt essentially, one big jubilee.
Yeah.
Although I don't think the word jubilee was used in the movie at all, which I now think was a horrible mistake. They should have just had
it was a missed opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's in the novel. I think I read it years ago, but I don't remember it being in the novel either.
Yeah.
Well, didn't the Bank of England burn down and they lost all of their stocks, which described in the book as accounting for debt? I forgot when.
I wonder how they recovered from that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the other weird thing too that I don't think we've read about specifically, or maybe it's been mentioned as a side thing, but specific to this group, because we go back and forth between kind of economics and history and intellectual history and note taking. But a lot of our note taking practices actually grow out of accounting and ledger keeping traditions in 14th 15th century Italy. So the idea of the waste book is I'm going to keep a little notebook where I write down all the transactions that happen during the day as like fleeting notes. And then when I go back to the office, or when I'm back into the quiet of the office at night, I take all those things and put them in my double entry bookkeeping system, AKA, and other places. I make them permanent notes, or I put them into my commonplace book, or whatever that is. But, so what happens when, your house burns down and you lose your card index in the fire is that, the 7-year jubilee that allows you to start afresh in your thinking, in your reading, and your sense making of the world. You have a vague recollection of the big important things, and you just start over from scratch, so that you're not weighed down with the baggage of the old ideas that you were stuck with. Or does the double entry and having 2 cards and I can compare what's on this one with this one allow me to break free and get rid of the one that's obviously patently wrong and move on with the new idea that's obviously or may seem to obviously be the better one.
Well, the other quote that I missed, I might have a record of it, I don't remember now, but whether I took a record, but I remember the quote. There was a saddlebag incident whereby the person making the notebooks suddenly realized that he needed to make them such that they would fit a saddlebag. So as you travel with your waste note or your current ledger and waste note, etc., it would all go sensibly inside a saddlebag. But as to whether and when the Bank of England burnt down, given the name of it, the Great Fire of London, was mostly what we now know as the City of London, with all the mercantile, insurance, and banking side. I don't recall, even in sort of it dipping into I forgot what his name is now. The diarist Pepys, who was around then, who managed to run away from the fire with his diaries, amongst other things.
But the fire was 1666. The Bank of England actually, were goldsmiths before the fire, but the Bank of England gets going after, really.
Yeah. The Bank of England, as it is now, the company stroke whatever the entity is.
Right.
But clearly banking was already happening.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right. Etc. So I can't recall hearing much about the economics, as it were, that came out of that. Other than there was so much there was sufficient information such that every time they tried to change the street layout to improve the street layout, the owners had enough information to stop that happening, with 1 or 2 exceptions. So London, the City of London, that square mile, still has all the little alleyways and closes and all the rest of it until relatively recently, i.e. World War II. And didn't get its chance to let's throw open the boulevards of Paris in a slightly better city, as it were. So, I'm even half wondering where you would find it now. The other thing, of course, is the Houses of Parliament, such as they were, was in the city of Westminster.
Right.
And the bulk of the palaces were, well, the big palace at the time was Hampton Court, which is even further down the river, to escape the stench of London. But not that far apart.
Wasn't there a royal palace across Knightsbridge?
It's Clarence House.
Yeah.
But that's a new building. I'll rephrase it. It's older than the Buckingham Palace, but it's a relatively new building.
But the Mint was at the Tower.
But the Mint was at the Tower and was on the windward side of the fire, so it wasn't that much of a problem. Plus the fact, I'm pretty sure that the tower would have survived and the contents, given the moat and the lack of combustion stuff in the moat. If the fire had managed to leap, then, and I'm not even quite sure whether the moat wasn't still wet then.
Well,
It's
the
not
fire
wet
didn't
now.
really cross the Fleet Ditch, did it?
Yeah, because the monument is quite much nearer the tower than the Fleet.
Oh, okay.
In fact, the Fleet is almost in Westminster. In fact, the other end of Fleet Street is the Strand, is Westminster before Trafalgar Square.
Okay.
So if you know London enough to know where Trafalgar Square is, that's like 400 metres west of where the boundary line is, because of course Theobald's Grove Gate, or the gate that is City of London Gate that went to Theobald's Grove, when we threw it away because the gates weren't big enough for all the traffic, was at that boundary. And likewise, the courts of the royal courts at the Bailey is the next building. So you've got the gate, the toll bridge of a toll road gate building is the joint.
And the wall of the Bailey was the wall, right?
And effectively, the old Bailey wall that then went off to Ludgate and the prison is the western edge of the City of London.
Okay. Which all maybe goes to illustrate that we are much more than Graeber says, focused on kingdoms and empires. Because he says along the way that, people aren't really that, throughout history, people weren't that much focused on where they stand with respect to kingdoms and empires, which I thought was kind of interesting. But then he goes on to talk about this idea of financing caravan trades, going all the way back to the days of these really, really early societies. And, it's the temples that are financing the caravan trade, perhaps. And the things that we learned in Dawn of Everything about, these agrarian cities, cities within agrarian regions trading with, and especially in Mesopotamia, right, where they have no metals and, none of these other resources that they need, that they have to trade with people from the hills to get. That strikes me as a really kind of interesting thing, that, that trade with people who aren't of your own community becomes really important, and that we gain these social technologies based on that.
I like that. As you mentioned, empire and empire building, I have been looking at a lot of older histories, and what happens when things like the Roman Empire collapses. What do all of its kind of satellite areas end up doing, or what do the there was a lot of heavy trade between Scandinavia, or what we now know as Scandinavia, and the Roman Empire, even though they didn't go out that far. And what those people ended up doing, and if in some sense, they're using some of the Roman ship technology, and then they start moving into Europe and raiding because they now don't have a reliance on things from the outside as a pressure. But I'm also now curious too. When I was reading some of that empire stuff, I wrote down a note that I really need to spend some time and get into Daniel Immerwahr's book on U.S. and empire.
Mhm.
And there's, from what I understand, the basic thesis is there's a shift in U.S. empire building in the early 1900s when we take over places like Hawaii. It's we're financially incentivized to do it, but we don't necessarily want to make it an official part of the empire, or there's a debate, because we're adding all these spaces between there and Puerto Rico and areas in Mexico where we're dabbling around in things. What happens when too much of the country is not white people, but people of color? Oh, so for racist reasons, let's not call it an empire. Let's do something else. Let's call it something else. Let's structure it differently than other places have before, versus, in looking at how the Roman Empire built and just subsumed things because they had their own slave problems, but they didn't look at things with the racial bias that we do.
Right.
We just, we're going to move in and they're going to become a client state like everyone should.
Mhm. Well, they're going to become Romans, yeah. And we didn't want, that was a big problem in the late 1840s, right? We didn't want to think about all of these people who had been Mexicans and were now Americans of the Southwest. And there were a lot.
But even in the Roman context, there were uprisings, let's say in Cisalpine areas, that then forced Rome to give them citizenship because they otherwise wouldn't have handed it to them, because in doing that gives them power.
Right. And
after having done that in several large swaths of their empire, suddenly in some sense, the power is dissipated out to the people so far, and the senators have their seats of power, which they obviously want to keep. But then that opens up space for there to become an emperor. And you can only become emperor as long as you don't use the word, or as long as you don't use the word for king, which the Romans had problems with.
Yes.
Or as Julius Caesar did, bringing in 50-odd Gaulish chieftains and says, these are all the new senators. So, that's really problematic in terms of where to get your troops from. And I think I said last week,
that was a problem that Carthage had
about how new the Roman Empire was, because even back in just before the Punic Wars, they still hadn't got the whole of the boot of Italy. And we're talking 250, 200 BC.
Yeah, nobody wanted the boot. You couldn't get. That was a problem that the Carthaginians had, right? Also, is the Carthaginian citizens of Carthage did not fight. They did not. They were not the.
But originally, the Roman army was Romans. You wouldn't put slave people or others. They could become mercenaries, and a lot of the time they used to use other cavalry because it was just too much for the normal citizen to have armor and a horse.
Mhm.
So the basic legionnaire, the original legionnaires at sort of Marius's time and before, were not conquered people. They were Roman.
Mhm.
And that's also why there is the laws of war to say you don't go to war in winter. You go before the harvest and after the sowing of the fields, because you have to be there to do your agrarian normal duties, which is how you earn your money, earn your position, and feed your family and everybody else.
Which explains why Cincinnatus goes back to the farm.
It's not even just that either, but eventually when Rome starts moving out as far as, invading Spain, or what's now Spain, it would take 3 or 4 months for you at the beginning of the year used to be March, and you would go out, and by the time you got there, like your year of leadership is nearly over. You don't have time to do anything. So they not only extended leadership periods, but they also moved the beginning of the year to January. So you could use the time in the winter from January to March to get out to the field of battle to then do something.
Yeah, but we, UK wise, we still run the tax year from the first week of April. And even in Pepys's time, before we changed the calendar again from the Julian to the Gregorian, it was the first week of the year was the end of March.
Yeah, which is why December is the 10th month.
Right.
Yeah.
But, you move it earlier and suddenly it's not the 10th month anymore.
Yeah. So, which kind of, although we're running out of time. So let me bring it back around to this idea of Jubilee. And because that's one of the things, just kind of generally, in the months that we've been talking about, all these different, books about the contemporary economy, corporations, and sort of this effective immortality, and property, existing in perpetuity in the in the hands of the people who acquire it, is kind of, in a way, it seems like the biggest challenge, right? That there isn't an opportunity to just clean just wipe the slate clean and say, okay, now we're starting again. Now we have no, there's no entrenched aristocracy. There's no entrenched class of debtors that can't be, that they can't move socially. So we have this whole idea of social immobility that derives from the fact that debt doesn't ever get discharged, and that property always, the property claims last forever, which seems to be that seems also to be very artificial to me, kind of thinking about it from this perspective.
Well, I find it interesting too, because a lot of that is rooted in, some of it in agrarian culture from biblical times that we then, especially for the far right Christian groups in America now, large portions of which are incredibly poor. Why aren't they rising up and saying, this is scripture, we should still have a jubilee?
Mm-hmm.
And we have nothing even remotely close to that. We'll focus on these parts of the text, but not on these parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's there. It is. It's the word of God. We should be doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow we don't seem to be. The only place in modern culture I see that idea brought forth is in the sabbatical, that
Yeah.
educators take. And even at that, not all educators are able to take and do that.
Right.
Even if it's a guaranteed contractual thing, 9 times out of 10, they're, you hit year 7 and you don't take that sabbatical.
Well, I'm at 6 and I'm being retrenched, so I won't get mine.
You'll get it. You just won't be paid for it. That's all.
Right, exactly. Right. So I guess that's the thing. Money, I should just ignore the whole money thing and say, yes, I'm getting my opportunity to pursue my own things. Yeah, the universe is providing it for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so yeah, so I guess it does strike me that he's using this, Graeber's using all of this to make some type of meta argument about things we believe in.
Well, I'm curious. I'm curious. He mentions the one, an anthropological, like mini study of a group of people where the Brahmins set up a structure whereby women get married, but to pay for the wedding, they have to become prostitutes to them and then go to camps and pay for the whole thing. And no one in the society questions it at all. And I almost, in reading that, he's not saying it out loud or specifically in beating us over the head with it, but in saying that, is he saying, yes, you as a at least in my case, a US citizen who's part of the Western banking system, are you just sitting there and taking your forced prostitution without questioning it?
Yeah.
And should you be?
Yeah.
Is that what he's saying there? Or is he just saying, is it just an example?
I was tempted to distrust that example, but I would agree with you that could entirely be what he meant to say with that. Yeah, that we are just not. I mean, and that I think he doubles down on that in Dawn of Everything, right? He says, we are so it's so difficult for us to see outside of this world that we believe was inevitable.
Yeah.
And these social relations that we think there are no, this is what civilization means, and there is no other way. Anybody who doesn't do this is by definition not civilized.
I haven't seen him suggest it, but there's also, at least, and we mentioned Kahneman and Tversky earlier, but there is that model of system one is your knee-jerk reaction thinking. And then there's a system 2 that requires you to put forth cognitive effort to think 2 or 3 levels deeper to figure out what's going on. And obviously reading debt is something that's going to require you to activate system 2 to get all of what you can out of it.
Yeah.
But are we stuck as a society because there are too many system 1 thinkers who, I'm one of the old guys who goes to McDonald's every day and I read the newspaper and I have my coffee and the world just keeps on going and I don't do anything about it because it's all system 1 thinking for me. I read what I read and I have a reaction to it and I don't actively make an effort to fix whatever that problem is in the world other than just being angry at it. And things like Twitter and social media make it a lot easier for you to do system 1 thinking where you're just upset at whatever the thing is, but no one is spending the time to do the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th levels to actively try and make it better. And shouldn't we all be doing a little more of that? Which I think to some extent, at least we're thinking here on a Saturday morning about these issues, whether we're doing anything about them in our actual lives or how many people are not reading Graeber, but watching this in reruns on, YouTube or Vimeo and improving their lives. I don't know, but
yeah,
he's not saying, I don't see yet anything, an argument that says we need to think deeper. But little vignettes like that, where I can read between the lines, what is David Graeber really trying to say? Or what do I think he's trying to say?
It's almost like, especially when he lists these primordial debts, right? He has his laundry list to the universe, to those who've created knowledge. It's his sort of retranslation of the stuff that came out of the Hindu culture, right? And he seems to be, kind of on the one hand trying to sort of say something rational about this, but on the other hand, kind of suggesting that this is all, that it's all very absurd, right? The idea that we can pay a debt to any of these things, these to humanity as a whole, to our parents, right? I love that vignette about, the father who gives his bill to the son, and the son pays it, but then never speaks to him again, because that obviously, that type of settling of accounts obviously signals a desire to end the relationship, not to continue it. So that whole question of, that the broader implication of that would be that sociability in general depends on these accounts never being settled.
Well, he says that, and when I saw that section, I immediately thought of the story of the prodigal son, which he may be tangentially referring to because it's a father and a son.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the biblical story where it's about the family and the tribe? And even though the son has gone away and misspent his fortune, he's come back, and who cares about the debt or the financial? He's family, so you have to bring him back.
Mm-hmm.
And in modern culture, we're more likely to do the scenario, you disown the family member because they came out, or they said something or did something. I I saw a sandwich board sign the other day in a store that was presumably meant for a Thanksgiving setting, like, put this in your house near your Thanksgiving table, and it said something like, choose a seat, not a side.
Nice.
And I was like, wow, that's like, that's a serious sentiment to have on what ostensibly is a tchotchke that you would put in as home decor, but it really says something about who we are and where we're at, and the intellectual debt you sit down with at Thanksgiving. Are you a family or are you an individual?
Yeah. It's interesting because where's the bridge too far? Where's the unforgivable sin actually live? And is there even one? I mean, I've heard some people say recently that, that they wouldn't, that they wouldn't throw their friends out for anything. And maybe that's just a way of responding to, to the idea of cancellation. But yeah, it is interesting to sort of ask those questions. And yeah, so I think that this has begun well, I think. And he's opening a lot of interesting boxes. It'll be interesting to see what he does with them.
Yeah. It's interestingly, it's not as dense as I expected it to be, but it's also way deeper than I anticipated it being at the same time. So
yeah, he had a good editor. Which he didn't have when he was dead, because they were rushing that other one so much. That's what he needed, the editor in the dawn of everything that he had in this. So what chapters? Good question. What chapters for next week? Let's look.
4 to 7.
4, 5, 6. How about 4, 5, 6? Because the 7, honor and degradation, the foundations of contemporary civilization, seems like it's going to be big. Seems like it's gonna recapitulate a lot of the stuff that's in the first 6 chapters, I would imagine. And I think I sort of vaguely remember. And that would take us from 104 to 226. That's a that's a pretty good chunk.
Yeah.
That sound good?
Like a plan.
Oh, there's some diagrams. Holy crap. It's not the circular flow model. Bilateral cross-cousin marriage. There you go.
Well, that's one of the things that comes up in Heinrich's weird book is how far out can you marry or not marry?
Oh, yeah.
Which is and Graeber kind of tangentially touches on that when he talks about some of the moiety systems that indigenous tribes are using. You go up and you can mess around with somebody of the opposite moiety and not worry about it.
Right.
Sex is fine.
Yeah.
But you don't break the other.
Right. So there's another book that interests me that I read a while back called The Sun Also Rises.
Not
And
Hemingway, though,
it
right?
is by not Hemingway, The Sun, S-O-N, and it's by a guy named Gregory Clark, and it's about its subtitle is Surnames and the History of Social Mobility. And basically the thesis is, in a nutshell, that there is no such thing as social mobility, and that wealth and status are incredibly persistent generationally. And it's an interesting kind of take on that. So anyway, we're over time.
As always, thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. So 4, 5, and 6 for next week, and I will get the recording going and post this as soon as I can, and the chat.
Who was the author on the Sun's book?
His name was Gregory Clark.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Thanks. See ya.
Yeah.